Hey, so if you've been following so far, I'm covering all the Penguin moderns. This is the seventh of 50, and this is George Orwell's notes on nationalism. And of all the Penguin moderns, when you first get the box, you see George Orwell and you think, okay, this is going to be a good one because everyone knows George Orwell from 1984 or Animal Farm, that he writes things which normally are quite popular. This essay collection, however, I don't know. I think it's not something that's going to be highly interesting to everyone. George Orwell is normally known as an essayist, a journalist, and so technically this is his better writing, but I think it's more historically based. I think not everyone will want to know of the three essays in this collection: Notes on Nationalism, Anti-Semitism in Britain, and The Sporting Spirit. Um, they're not all going to be of interest to everyone. Um, but, being from England, I thought I might like to brush up on my history. And unfortunately, I think I'm falling a bit out of love with George Orwell. I think that from reading this book, I think I found something that I generally have always not liked about George Orwell, but only until now it seems obvious. When George Orwell writes, he never writes from his own personal perspective. Just think about it for a second. Think for a second who you think George Orwell is, and you'll find it's very hard to say anything about George Orwell. What is a George Orwell impression? What is something George Orwell kind of feels strongly about? It's quite hard to tell from his writing. And I know we have this idea of him as being this very political and social person, and he does talk about a lot of politics and social things in his book, but it's always very hard to find his position because he spends all of his times in his essays and in his stories talking about what other people do, what other people think, and what other people make you do or think. And it's very clever because he keeps himself neutral, and you kind of buy into almost whatever generalizations he makes. And I'm not saying that his generalizations are technically wrong. I'm just saying that it's deceptively socially engineered in a way that you forget that he's got to have an opinion somewhere too. He's got his own self-interest somewhere. And that perhaps some of these generalizations, if they were made from an actual personal point of view, some of the hypocrisy would come true. I think that George Orwell's writing a lot of the time is talking about how governments or big groups of people think a certain way or control the majority, the majority controlling, being controlled by like a supreme power. But at the same time, it's almost a bit like sometimes I wonder whether he is doing the same thing he is criticizing by telling us exactly how most of us respond to this supposed thing that happens. Anyways, I'll get into the actual essays now. So, Notes on Nationalism. George Orwell makes a nice distinction between what he says is nationalism, with people who attach emotion to what is called a nation, a single race or a geographical area. But really, he says that it's defined by the desire for power. A nationalist is hungry for power. They're megalomaniacs. So all nationalism he is proposing is bad. It's actually disguised as protecting one's values, but it's a will to power. But he says patriotism, on the other hand, is often seen as the same word, but it's different. Patriots are merely defending what they see as their tradition, but they do not impose it on others, and that's his key distinction. The nationalists will force their views on you, whereas a patriot will not. As he tells you his views on this, And so there's some kind of irony here. It seems that he is calling out nationalism as as something bad. But then at the same time, he is defining it so carefully and meticulously, and then he makes distinctions of positive, transferred, and negative nationalism, and then subcategories, for example, neo-Toryism, Celtic nationalism, and Zionism as positive nationalists, transferred nationalism as communism, political Catholicism, and color feeling, class feeling, pacifism, and negative nationalism as Anglophobia, anti-Semitism, Trotskyism. So he does say that it's a bit simplified and, it's exaggerated, but it does seem like he is trying to categorize most views in certain ways. And also something that really came through in these essays is just how much he is against religion, he sees it as propaganda. He sees religion almost as a vehicle of propaganda for this will to power of nationalism. Religion is almost like a disguise for nationalism. And he has a lot of dislike for the author G.K. Chesterton, who I've read a book by him, The Man Who Was Thirsty, which I actually really liked it. I liked it more than George Orwell's stories. But Chesterton was a Catholic. And in the second essay, Anti-Semitism in Britain, Orwell actually says Chesterton makes some anti-Semitic remarks, but I haven't seen that in the Man Who Was Thursday. Perhaps in some other writing by him it is, but the amount of personal dislike Orwell has for Chesterton just in these two essays makes me think that maybe he's not as balanced or as neutral as he makes out in the rest of his writing. And it also made me wonder who George Orwell really is when reading this. And it gave me a bit of skepticism that he could be so balanced about everything else and then get really emotional about Chesterton, who I think was his kind of contemporary at the time as another British popular author who was just writing, Christian stories instead. And in Anti-Semitism in Britain, we find that actually back in the 30s and 40s, if we're assuming what he's writing here is representative of the times, that anti-Semitic jokes and humor was very common, and that essentially he tries to bring it back to how Hitler sort of sees things, but it's very loose. I kind of I don't find it as detailed as I would like. It seems like he never really develops his points. He has no references or sources. He would just generalize so massively all of the time. It's almost like Orwell's trying to provoke by suggesting that there is a conflict between two groups of people, neither of which he is associated with. Like, he never identifies with any group, but he defines the two groups and their interactions and then tries to tell us what to do about them, while at the same time telling us that nationalism is a terrible thing. It's just, there is some shadiness I come across when I read Orwell in this way. When you read him in his dystopian stories, you're like, okay, yes, totalitarianism is bad. But then when you read it in these essays, it's almost like you feel like he is part of the problem he is criticizing. And so I think Orwell is part of the problem that he is criticizing. And for that reason, I'm starting to think of him as a little overrated and someone I don't want to read too much more of, because I think I've read the best of what he has to offer. The final essay, The Sporting Spirit, is essentially saying how he thinks that sport and other global events that are often seen as ways of uniting nations, that are often promoted as such, are actually ways of promoting nationalism and tensions between nations, which then lead or contribute to wars. So he's just quite negatively saying how football and things like boxing, the way that the losing team feels that they have lost face is similar to how people feel in the war. And I mean, yes, that's true. It's a short essay. It's like 8-9 pages long, but it's like, it's not that deep. It's not that deep to think that a football match between two countries is symbolic of a nationalist struggle. Like it kind of is. It's like, yeah. And it's kind of, I'm just trying to wonder what he's almost like he's criticizing it, like these are bad things in society that we have these, but it's almost like he's just trying to stir up conflict himself. Like it's a job of a political writer to find conflict. Sometimes I think they invent it or they exaggerate it. And in this book, I didn't find or discover new ways of nationalism and control. I got much more from reading Bertrand Russell's skeptical essays. He has some essays on politics in there, which I think were more interesting. And even though they're similarly vague on this level, they're kind of talking a very general level about politics. I think Bertrand Russell's approach was much more just balanced and level and developed and just more interesting and useful than what we have here, which is quite a dated account of things that were happening in England. And really, it is just a showcase of what George Orwell thought about current times in an unfiltered way. And if anything, it shows that his stories are better. Unfortunately, 1984 and Animal Farm, I think, serve as better messages for his views on nationalism than his actual essays, because his essays are so full of generalizations and some personal attacks on Chesterton, which are just tangents, that it makes him seem less credible. One thing I would say though is, if ever you were to read Orwell, I think his best thing, that the best thing I've read so far by far, was Down and Out in Paris and London. I think that as an account of homelessness and poverty is very, very interesting. And I think maybe it's one of the better books because apart from the end and the beginning where he actually does make a message, most of the story you don't feel like he's telling you a message or a generalization about a certain type of people. You don't feel like you're being preached to about some political conflict for most of it. It's just he is poor and he is trying to survive, and so it works as a story, and that almost makes it feels like he's writing from the heart as much as he ever did write from the heart. Because reading this, frankly, so cold, so impersonal, and so dated, I wouldn't think anyone would really love to read this. I think anyone who really likes this either doesn't go deep enough into political theory or political history, because you can just get so much more from other texts, or just someone who just likes Orwell for just at a first surface level, just will like anything Orwell writes. I think if you read this with any level of open-mindedness, it raises eyebrows over what I've read before from Orwell. It almost doesn't seem like the same person that I read in this book. But it was okay. It obviously, Orwell's writing style is very curt and concise, and he does really make his sentences count. It's just that in this book, his sentences were counting for a political argument that didn't seem to go anywhere. So it's okay. I'll give it 3 stars, but again, I don't know if this is an example which I don't think represents Orwell in a great light. Perhaps he's done better essays outside of this, but these 3 essays I didn't care too much for. So with that, happy reading.